These G-forces have a profound effect on their body. They're heavily strapped into the seats within the cockpit. Their vital organs are obviously moving under G-force, and to protect their vital organs and their spine, they need to brace. The original driver that I started working with was Jamie Green in DTM, and then moved into kart racing with various young drivers. Alex Albon was one of them at 13 years old, Kevin Magnussen at 16 years old. To help nurture and develop them, they're part of their athletic performance to prepare themselves for that journey to Formula One.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Masters of Innovation. I've got a really exciting episode today. As you probably know, I'm a big F1 fan, have worked at McLaren and love everything to do with Formula One. Now, we've talked a little bit about high performance from a cultural perspective, also from just a general technology and innovation perspective, but we haven't talked about it from the human perspective. And to give me driver's perspective, we've got Simon, who's a driver performance coach for some of the biggest names in the business. So Simon, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. My name's Simon Reynolds. I'm a driver performance coach. Been working in motorsport for the past 19 years, working with drivers from grassroots karting all the way through to Formula One. I was very fortunate to work for McLaren for 14 of those years, starting in 2006, and was supported by various specialists throughout that time to support me. So I was more of a conduit of their incredible master of information to filter through to the drivers and supporting them in their human performance endeavors to become world champions, race winners, etc. throughout those divisions of motorsport, moving through from karting into the Formula racing, Formula 4, Formula 3, Formula 2, and then obviously the higher echelons of Formula 1.
Which is pretty cool. And obviously you've brought people on the journey, which I think is really quite exciting, because some of the drivers that you've worked with are now in Formula One that you've kind of nurtured. I think you mentioned Alex Albon and a few others previously. Tell me a bit about that in terms of the journey and the perspective as the drivers go on. Because I mean, you start in karting, and I guess like it's quite a different thing, because at age 14, what you need from a driver performance coach is slightly different to a fully fledged Formula One driver. So there's quite a lot going on there, I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate to be supported by the chief medical officer, the infamous Dr. Aki Hintsa, who then went on to who founded Hintsa Performance, which support a number of drivers throughout the Formula racing and Formula One. And we worked together for 10 years, and he supported me with his specialists from Finland and surrounding areas of the world. And the idea at that time in 2006 was to develop a human performance center, which was called the Fitness and Wellbeing Center within the McLaren headquarters at MTC in Woking. And I started working with the physio of Lewis Hamilton at that time, who was my line manager, and then my supportive manager or boss was Dr. Aki Hintsa. And I started working closely with them on developing a young driver program with senior management and a number of other engineers throughout that period. And my role within that was working on the human performance part of that to develop drivers' training programs and nutritional programs supported by sports nutritionists, psychology supported by sports psychologists, etc., etc. So the driver becomes a very centric part of that development team. And the original driver that I started working with was Jamie Green in DTM, in some GT, sort of touring car racing, and then moved into kart racing with various young drivers. As you alluded to, Alex Albon was one of them at 13 years old. Oliver Rowland at 14 years old, Nick de Vries at 14 years old, Kevin Magnussen at 16 years old. And to help nurture and develop them, they're part of their athletic performance to prepare themselves for that journey to Formula One. So the ultimate aspirational goal was Formula One, and there was these short-term goals that we were setting throughout that period whilst they were moving through the ranks of karting into Formula racing of Formula 4, Formula 3, and Formula
Sure.
One.
Right. So Formula One driver, or a motor, just a driver in general. What is the unique things about a driver? Because obviously you think about footballers and they've got to be agile and they've got to move and change direction very quickly. So that has quite a different kind of thing. A cyclist obviously has enormous quads and lower body and legs to drive over a Tour de France kind of victory. What's the unique things about a driver? Obviously, the first thing that I think about is the neck, but I'm interested to get your sense of what are the things that are unique to a driver that are different to other sports people.
Yeah, so most sport, especially in Formula racing, so we call it like single seaters, open wheel or open cockpit, the demands are extremely high with G-force. So when the cars are moving through air effectively at 200 miles an hour, when they're maneuvering through corners, they're generating lateral G-forces, and then under braking, they're creating longitudinal G-forces. So these G-forces have a profound effect on their body. For example, they're heavily strapped into the seats within the cockpit. However, their vital organs are obviously moving under G-force, and to protect their vital organs and their spine, they need to brace, effectively like bracing your core. You hear about that within training. Well, when they're cornering at those high speeds, they are bracing through the core and protecting their vital organs and their spine from effectively traveling within the rib cage. So,
and I was going to say, Simon, can I pick up on that? Because I think that's something that people don't really recognize during a GP, is that like a driver, as they go into a high-speed corner, is, actually bracing and physically getting ready for the G-force that's about to arrive. I don't think people really actually realize. And what is that? An inhale, a tightening of the muscles? Is there like a technique there?
It's an automated response that athletes will sort of learn, and an automated pattern that should happen anyway when you train, when you're lifting sort of heavier loads. Where you were talking about the difference between, say, a footballer and a Formula One driver. There's quite significant differences within. You've got a dynamic sport, meaning that the individual is moving, changing direction, accelerating, decelerating, etc. And that's placing a different emphasis on the body compared to a Formula One driver, where they're effectively reclined in a more static state without that dynamic movement. And the only movement then is from the steering and then from braking. So below Formula One, there's no power steering. So the actual steering is extremely heavy. The braking in Formula 3, some Formula One drivers will say, what's the most physical car to drive? It'd probably be a Formula 3 car. The level of G-force, the steering load, and the actual brake forces are extremely high. In Formula One, they have power steering. However, the forces on the neck are more considerable than the formulas below, because the car is traveling faster. If a car travels faster, then the G-forces under braking will be heavier. And in cornering, if you can go around a corner faster, then the lateral forces are going to be higher. So the difference between a footballer and a Formula One driver are very, very different. However, they may have similar VO2 max levels, even though the driver is not dynamic in their sort of field or pursuit. Whereas the footballer obviously moves a lot more. But the ability for the Formula One driver to protect their body is going to be much greater, because they're under that G-force that footballers aren't.
It's in that ways it's slightly different to, I don't know, other sports in some ways, because if you think, a footballer or something like that, there might be a 16-year-old or 15-year-old that breaks through into the Premier League and maybe isn't the finished article to a certain degree fitness-wise and only has to play a certain amount of minutes or something like that. But the flip side of Formula One, because it's such a, it's the pinnacle, there's only like I said, like 20 seats or something like that. It's this journey that the driver's been on has all been working up to that point. So the point that the moment that they get to the sport, they need to, or the physical foundation kind of needs to already be there, because there's so many other factors that they've got to deal with: the psychological impact, the pressure, as you can imagine, across all kind of spheres. And obviously through that whole journey, as you've been taking the driver on, and you talked about stuff like VO2 max and stuff like that, I've got a Garmin watch. I've started kind of tracking a little bit of my kind of health metrics and stuff. I know a lot of other people are doing the same. I'm interested to get your sense of, where data kind of plays into this whole thing. Obviously, you mentioned it in the kind of initial phases, obviously ongoing and tracking. I'm interested to get your sense of, some of the off-the-shelf stuff like the Aura, the Garmins, the Whoops and stuff like that. How useful are they? Is the data good for the average kind of consumer that might be watching this? Like, what are the kind of key metrics that maybe they should be thinking about or looking at?
The basic ones are measuring heart rate. So if we do a VO2 max test and a blood lactate test or a lactate test, which infers the acidity that we accumulate and those thresholds, we can then also use gas analysis as well. So you've probably seen where somebody runs along with a gas mask on. We can then link and analyze the gases from the analysis crossing over with the lactate that's accumulating at higher intensities. We can then start to look at the thresholds of aerobic thresholds and then up to their critical power. So you get two different sort of thresholds. You get where there's a greater accumulation of lactate, and then there's an exponential rise in lactate when you get to what we call the critical power of the second threshold. So when we train, you've probably heard of these zones like zone 1, zone 2. Zone 2 is a very big thing at the moment. That's really your base level. It's very important to work on building a foundation of your capacity or your aerobic capacity using oxygen. And then as you move into the higher echelons of the accumulation of lactate, the accumulation of hydrogen ions, the burning sensation that you feel at high intensities, if we can develop an individual to work at higher peaks of force, wattage, for example, on a bike, we can use wattage to gauge their forces and intensity that we can map into these, which we can correlate with heart rate to work on their zones. That then has a shift of those thresholds further to the right, if that makes sense. So those two thresholds then move further to the right. So you've got the individual got greater capacity. So they have greater capacity to use oxygen, and they've got greater capacity then to work towards their VO2 max. In terms of different kind of data analytics and devices that we can wear, heart rate monitors are kind of the most basic, which if you've got a basic heart rate monitor, can pick up on your heart rate. You can use that to work on your zones and improve your thresholds, etc., as a basic way of working. There's various ways of doing that, which we could go into on another time. But we've all heard of, or may have heard recently of, the heart rate variability. And this is sort of measuring between the beats. So not the actual heartbeat itself, but between the beats. And looking at the autonomic nervous system, we've got which is made up of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And we're looking at the two different systems to be sort of in harmonious synergy. And obviously that can vary between individuals, and it can vary throughout and fluctuate all the time. And there's we're not looking for perfect, we're looking to monitor an individual and find out what's normal for that individual. So we've got various monitors that we can use for that. And even a lot of the Garmins and the Polars, etc., now have obviously the heart rate variability ways of measuring. And we've got the Whoop and the Aura Ring as the obvious examples a lot of people wear now. But people need to understand that we're measuring the responses from the nervous system, where the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system, effectively. And then your parasympathetic system, this is all very basic, but at rest, and is your rest and digest, or your digestive system. The parasympathetic system promotes kind of like your recovery, and it conserves energy. So it's part of that recovery process. Is when we're in our sort of relaxed state and our recovery state, effectively, when our digestive system's working and operating really well, and we're able to digest our food, it goes through the systems, and then obviously the other side more effectively. When and I say that in the most
that was a very politically correct way.
But it's a stimulation of that process, which is really important as part of our digestive system. Now, when we're particularly stressed, we get a higher sympathetic response, we get a higher cortisol level response within the body, which is our fight or flight systems, and this suppresses your digestion. So this means that you you're trying to run away from a bear, for example, and in order to do so, we're getting that suppressed system during that time, which stimulates also glucose release as well. So we're burning through lots of sugars. Now, when we relate this to drivers, for example, over a race weekend, they're going to have very high levels of sympathetic responses because the adrenaline and the stress of the actual event is going to be extremely high. And we have to then monitor that and work on the parasympathetic responses, especially with their recovery. So recovery is extremely important part of monitoring a driver's race weekend, where they're going to be using lots and lots of glucose, which is a nutritional element. So we need to make sure that they're feeding themselves and fueling themselves properly, good balance of high carbohydrates, especially at a race weekend. So the amount of intake of carbohydrates are going to be quite different to a normal working week than actually the race weekend itself.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, for sports people, I've definitely heard of this concept of carb loading and eating like a ton of pasta before, you know, a game or something like that. I assume it's a similar kind of concept for drivers, right? What would be a typical pre-race meal for a driver? I mean, is it just an extremely like a ton of pasta and some chicken? Is it that boring? Is it?
Well, you're not far off, to be fair. I mean, it depends on the individual and what they like. But the objective is to fuel the body. So carbohydrates convert to glycogen, which converts, obviously it goes a little bit deeper than that, but it eventually converts, hydrogen, etc., but then becomes energy. And combine that with oxygen, etc. That's our energy source, our fuel. Then you've got your proteins, which are the building blocks of our body, which are made up of a spectrum of amino acids. And these are really important as part of our recovery and our muscle, etc. And it does have an energy component to it as well, together with fats. And fats are extremely important as part of health and our fuel source. So obviously fats become a really important fuel source for anyone, and especially for athletes. So we need to create a balance of those macronutrients. And then you've got your micronutrients that are coming from, your vitamins and minerals, which are made up of fruits and vegetables and other types of foods and salts, etc., which are then utilized by the body to run the systems. So you've got your fuel, you've got your building blocks, and then you've got your transportation of important fat-soluble vitamins. And then you've got your micronutrients from vitamins and minerals, which are then that support structure of all those systems working harmoniously. So it's a really important part of that system to make sure that the driver's nutrition is on point. And going back to your question, for a race weekend, we want to fuel them with lots of oats and pastas and rices and maybe some breads, but mainly sort of foods which aren't going to cause any digestive type issues, but fueling the body's systems and limiting, maybe, for example, a lunch would limit the amount of vegetables compared to maybe the evening, because the vegetables contain high amounts of fiber, which may fill them up and stop them eating more kind of fuel. So we want
but not provide the energy that they need.
Exactly. Yeah. So there may be sort of manipulations there, depending on the driver and what their preferences are. They're all individuals, and they find certain nutritional meals might suit them better than others.
And obviously today, you've been on that journey, right? You've worked directly with F1 drivers through your time at McLaren. You've obviously now set up your own kind of company as well, Formula to Perform, which is really quite exciting. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're up to now with Formula to Perform, and obviously some of the drivers you work with. I know you work with some drivers in F1 Academy as well, female drivers and male, so it's quite exciting. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what you're up to these days.
Absolutely. So I left McLaren at the end of 2019 after 14 years, and I started my own company a few months later, Formula to Perform. 2 weeks before lockdown was the timing was fantastic at that point. So, but however, this gave me the opportunity to really develop that throughout that year and allow me to build up and structure the business using all of the knowledge and expertise from others and from what I learned over the years to drive into how I would effectively drive my business. So taking on drivers throughout karting, and through the formulas up to Formula One. So that Formula Two, Formula Three, Formula Four, and then that division from karting to the formulas is kind of where I specialize. So I've developed a program which is called the Formula to Perform. So the formula is what I've learned from working with the best drivers in the world over that past 19 years, and developing certain strategies and certain interventions, and the way I process my programs working with drivers to provide them with structured training, structured preparation, and also when I'm at race events working with drivers, really building relationships is key to this role. I would say most of my role is building a relationship. When I can find out and learn about an individual, you can then optimize them and get the best out of them and help them reach their winning potential, help them reach their athletic potential. And it's really, that's what I would say. And I become that conduit of all the information I've ever learned from all those great and masterful specialists, and Dr. Aki Hinter is then filtering that information into working with drivers and getting the best out of them and keeping things simple as well. The one thing I've learned over the years is don't overcomplicate things. Keep things really simple, seamless. Try not to change the program too much, because you can't monitor change if you're constantly changing a program. So allow the individual to adapt to the program, start to work on increasing volume and intensity, and then make some adaptations and changes once you've assessed how that program has fundamentally worked based on assessments. And then you can monitor the individual using heart rate variability, using subjective questionnaires, which are super important, because we shouldn't rely too much on heart rate variability and heart rates, etc., because they're just one objective tool that we can use within a huge toolbox of other metrics we can look at as well. And sleep, for example, a bad night's sleep is not a bad thing, but 2 nights or 3 nights of bad sleep can affect an individual's performance. But we need to understand that from an objective and a subjective insight. We need their information. We're not within their body. We can look at certain data, but it's not giving us a true representation of their whole entire system. So we need them to give us and communicate with good insight into understanding that. In addition, Formula to Perform also, part of that is working with engineers in the past and present to understand telemetry. So understanding what information that we can extract from the car and how the driver's performing in the car and how that can relate to preparing them better, if that makes sense. So we can look at brake traces, throttle traces, etc., their head position, even on video analysis, what's happening. And we can then start to build a picture of ensuring that we're working with the engineers to ensure that we're extracting as much performance out of the car, which is then piloted by the driver to optimize their actual performance. And that's that man and machine blending together and creating that synergy.
That's really exciting. It's stuff I know, because obviously you were mentioning with, I think it was the Formula 3 car, that the brake is like so much stronger than in other things. But you could imagine, if we're not getting 100% throttle activation, that might actually be a leg strength issue. And like you said, if the head is moving too much, the eye line is not on the apex of the corner, and therefore actually we need to work on neck strength. But I never really thought of actually the engineer insights coming into that human kind of loop. So that's quite an interesting and exciting development. So you work directly with the engineers of drivers as well to kind of monitor that, I guess.
I do, yeah, absolutely. When you're at race events, there has to be that relationship between the mechanic builds the car, the engineer develops the strategy, the plan. My job is to make sure that the driver is optimizing their own performance so they can deliver the strategy the engineers create, and then they can drive the machine that the mechanics have developed based on the setup that the engineer has developed. So there's this complete synergy, and if everyone's working together and communicating really well, then we can create a more harmonious way of working, which ultimately strives towards the race win. And it's so multifactorial, and so many unknowns and so many things out of your control. But what you can control is, we can control lots of things, like making sure the driver sleeps effectively. We can have interventions and educate the driver on what sleep hygiene looks like. No phones and
blue light at night,
watching YouTube and videos and things like that prior to bedtime, because the light transmits, and then it increases your cortisol levels, increase your sympathetic responses, adjust the parasympathetic responses, and then you almost end up in this fight or flight and you can't sleep. Whereas reading a book and cascading your vision across the page, studies have shown that actually helps induce sleep. And having dim lighting helps to calm and increase your parasympathetic response and help you sleep. Having certain nutrition too late in the evening can increase your metabolism, which is part of your autonomic systems, which then create awakening response. So timing of meals is really important. Timing of training, if you're training high intensity training, doing a spin class at 9 o'clock at night, or even 8 o'clock, or even 7 o'clock, that's going to increase your body's stress response, and that's going to probably affect your sleep. The same way as having coffee after maybe 2 o'clock, for example, which the caffeine accumulation can affect your sleep later on, and hours later. So there's lots of things that we can do to ensure that the drivers are maximizing their kind of preparation for competition.
Yeah, and I guess, like anything, it's how do we control the factors that we can control as best as we can? And I think through the journey that you are on with a driver, it's, we're building up their actual peak performance, so that when they get to the likes of Formula One or upper echelons of motorsport, that they're already developed. And then at that point when they're there, how do we make sure that we control the factors that we have control over? A high stress incident might happen. We have to manage that as it is. But to be honest, like, if we get some good sleep, if we're able to, manage the factors that we have control over, we can increase performance. So Simon, if there was a driver watching this, like, that's coming up through the kind of ranks and was like, actually, do you know what, this is the kind of thing that I would definitely need in my, and wanted to get into contact with yourself or Formula to perform. I mean, what would be the best way of doing that? Obviously, you have social media channels, you have a website. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the best way to get in contact with you.
Yeah, sure. So I have an Instagram page, Formula to Perform, under my name, Simon Reynolds. And I'm working on my website at the moment. I used to have a website, and I'm sort of in the stages of developing a new version of that.
Cool.
So that will be out soon, over the next few months. And that's effectively the most appropriate way, or even on LinkedIn. So I've got a LinkedIn profile, Simon Reynolds, on there, ASCC, which is accredited strength and conditioning coach. Cool. So that will be on there. So you can look me up on there to get some advice. And I'm more than happy to talk to any driver. It's not always about the business side. It's making sure that you can offer some helpful advice to drivers and upcoming drivers who are interested in their own human performance and interested in how to optimize their preparation ahead of competition. So reach out, not just to look for a performance coach, but also some advice as well.
Yeah. I mean, before we close, last thing, from the drivers that you have worked with, and say, if there was a driver watching and there was a piece of advice just more generally around the human performance factor, is there something that you're seeing consistently? Like, is it as simple as, controlling the controllables as a key point, or is it any kind of nuggets of advice more generally for an up and coming driver?
Yeah, I mean, keep things simple is the most important thing, and don't try and do everything, and don't copy anything you see on social media. Keep it simple, get the advice. And when it comes to training, the most basic movement patterns are always the best, and those are your bread and butters. Like squatting, for example. There's various ways of squatting, but a basic goblet squat where you're holding a dumbbell close to your body is a wonderful way to build the leg strength, for example. There's various other ways of doing that as well. A press up or push up, depending on what you deem it. Fantastic way to build upper body strength in that pressing movement pattern. Great for building shoulder stability and shoulder endurance, and core strength. I use the word core because everyone knows what that means. it's a bit more complicated than that. I don't like using the word core, but I prefer stability of the body and neuromuscular control and things like that. But core strength, we call it, is very good for that. And then you've got rowing movements. So rowing movements are fundamental for drivers, especially when they're sitting in these kind of flex positions, and this can affect their posture. So the fascial tissue that surrounds your muscles and organs as a protective tissue can adapt into those positions, together with muscles becoming shorter and tighter, and potentially weaker in other areas. So we can then look at somebody's biomechanics, for example, and start to strengthen the right muscles, and sort of work on maybe even lengthening and mobilizing muscles that have become more restricted, which are restricting joint range of motion. So the process that I would take a driver through, as I said before, would be that assessment process. So my advice to any up-and-coming driver is get assessed first. Have an assessment first to know where you are, collect some data on you as an individual.
Establish a baseline.
Establish a baseline, exactly. So we need that performance baseline in order to understand. Otherwise, you just guess. You need to have a good estimation. Otherwise, you end up guessing where that person is. So we need to assess an individual and not guesstimate where they are. Otherwise, we can't develop a bespoke program for that individual.
Makes sense. Perfect. Simon, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing a few more of the things you're doing, and also some of the drivers that are on your kind of watch list progressing to the upper echelon. So Simon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.